Hi everybody, Tim Hughes here. I'm the CEO of Digital Leadership Associates. I'm really excited today. Today I've got Remi Baker. Remi, through the amazing technology, is actually in Sydney in Australia. And Remi has had two microchips implanted in her body, and that's what we're going to talk about the merger of people and technology. So before we get started, Remi, tell everybody where they can get hold of you.
Yeah, so my name's Remi Baker. I am Strategy Director at PhD Australia. You can get hold of me either on LinkedIn, so Remi Baker at PhD, or through my Twitter account, which is Remi_Baker.
Great. So Remi, tell me your story. So how did you get to where you are today?
So I'm originally from the UK, so I am from Devon. I moved to London a number of years ago and actually started my career at PhD International. So PhD is a media and communications agency. And I started my career working on global brands, essentially at PhD. I did that for just over 4 years, and then I actually moved into a creative role. So I went publisher side and was in creative solutions. And then at the end of that, I decided to make the move to Sydney. So early last year, I moved over to Australia and came back to PhD, but this time in a role in strategy. So for the last year and a half, I have been doing media and comm strategy work for a number of quite big clients. So I do media strategy for Google, Unilever, Audi and Skoda. And I am also involved in PhD's kind of thought leadership. So we do a lot of work championing and looking at industry trends.
Fantastic. So, and it's actually through that you actually got involved in this merger of people and technology project.
Yeah.
You basically do your founder does a book every 2 years. And
so basically,
go ahead.
Yeah, PhD as a company, we release a book every 2 years. So the most recent book was called Merge, and that was released last year. And it basically looked at how technology and humanity are going to become intrinsically linked in the future. So it's launched globally, and then we do a local launch here in Australia. In the book, it basically looks at the 5 different evolutionary stages of our adoption of technology. So it starts by looking at essentially the first phase is called surfacing, and it's essentially when we started to get an introduction into screens and when the World Wide Web was created. The second stage, which was slightly later, is organizing, and it's basically the introduction of things like Google and search, and how we started to operate and organize that data. And then the third stage is kind of the stage of which we're in at the moment, which is called extracting. And it basically looks at actually the introduction of machine learning and how that is kind of intercepting several different areas of technology. So it looks at 8 different areas where we're going to see fundamental developments in technology.
And these are things like hearables, wearables, being voice activated, implants and things like that.
Yeah, so one of the sections within those 8 is actually next wave wearables. And it essentially talks about when wearable technology is going to start to even get greater understanding essentially of us as individuals and how it's going to be able to respond to that. So for the launch of the book here in Australia, we organised a technology expo. So essentially, I began conversations with local technologists and futurists in order to kind of initiate those conversations. And when I was doing some research about what new technology was available here in Australia, I came across implants, which are essentially microchips that are inserted under the skin. And there's a company who are called Future Sumo, who actually offered it here in Sydney. So when I came across the opportunity, I was really intrigued and curious basically to see what the whole process involved and, you know, what the opportunities were at the moment. So I organised a meeting with Future Sumo and I went and had an initial conversation with them. And then off the back of that conversation, I then decided, you know, I had to get it done. For me, because I work in a role in strategy and in media, I think the most interesting facet is actually understanding how this technology is going to then impact our behavior and the implications that it's going to have. And I thought if that's something that we were going to be featuring at the expo, that I would love to have the experience of actually understanding the whole process, what it takes to get it done, what I can essentially use it for, and also thinking about what those opportunities are as well. So
what happened? What did they do? I mean, I guess you went. They didn't do it at the meeting. You went away and thought about it, and then went back there. But what did they do?
Yeah, so I went away and then decided that I was definitely interested in getting it done. So essentially, we went in and had the chips inserted. So it was myself and my colleague, Mitch.
And actually inserted where?
It's 2 chips, one in each hand. So they're actually inserted kind of in the fleshy part of your hand, so between your thumb and your finger.
Yeah.
So the chips are 2 microchips. So one is an RFID chip and one is an NFC chip. So they both have different purposes. NFC, so like essentially the same technology that's in your bank card, that you use for PayPass or contactless payments. So we've talked about the 2 different types of chips and what it was possible to put on either chip. So myself and Mitch actually decided to get both chips done. Because there were actually so few people in Australia who already have these microchips inserted, we actually ended up having Channel 9 News turn up and film the process, which was quite intimidating.
Okay.
But essentially we had a local piercer. So she does piercing training for the whole of New South Wales. And they start essentially by numbing the area. So you have kind of numbing cream on for an hour or so. And then they have a preloaded syringe, which houses the chip. So the chip is essentially kind of the size of a grain of rice. So it's quite small.
Right.
And it's preloaded in the syringe, and they essentially go into the flesh part of your hand and then release the chip and extract. So it's actually quite a simple process. So anyone who's either had a piercing or had a tattoo, like it's not particularly painful. It's a little bit uncomfortable. Didn't really bleed, didn't really leave a lot of a mark either.
And can you feel it underneath it, or?
I actually can't, which is probably a little bit worrying. But when you first get it done, essentially it sits kind of closer to the surface. But you are kind of encouraged not to do anything too manual with your hands for a little while, just so that the chip can settle in place. And so basically at the moment, in terms of what I have on the chip, so in my left hand, I have my RFID chip, and that's essentially linked to my office pass.
So you can basically open doors with your hand then, rather than.
Yeah, so I basically swipe my hand to enter into the office, to use the printer, to do kind of different functions that would otherwise require my pass. And then on my right hand, I have my NFC chip, which at the moment doesn't sound all that exciting, but I have my LinkedIn information.
Right.
So if I want to be one of those really poncy people at a networking event, I can actually give someone my LinkedIn
that's
profile.
My business card.
Essentially.
Yeah.
There are other opportunities. So one of the big discussions we had was actually around, what's possible to put on the chip, like in terms of what's feasible, but also from a legal perspective, because one of the biggest challenges is that actually legislation hasn't really caught up with this new form of technology. It's still very niche. So from a feasibility standpoint, it's actually possible to put your Opal card, so essentially the same as your Oyster card in London.
Equivalent to our Oyster. So that's a card that we use to get around the tube in London. Yeah.
So essentially to put that card on there. So for transport purposes, so getting the bus, getting the train, to be able to just tap and pay with your hand. And then the other opportunity is actually your bank card, because it's essentially the same technology that's in a contactless bank card, that you could put your bank card on there and actually use it to make payments. So the challenge with those two at the moment is that actually from a legal perspective, they're not they're not essentially legal at the moment because you're replicating data.
Well, they're not illegal, but they're just not. I mean,
Yeah, so
I've always found using my phone actually quite irritating because I can tend to like you've got music on or something, and then you want to and so maybe it's my generation that I've grown up with where you had a watch and it just told the time. Now people don't want watches because they actually want things because it's got multiple uses. But I can see that actually having my a credit card or something facility on my hand would actually be quite useful. Though it's quite scary for some people because they just pile up a load of debt, wouldn't they?
True. I think that actually there are a couple of kind of ways in which an implant can be quite useful. So we obviously, when we talk about actually our adoption of technology, it's generally based around two areas. So firstly is the perceived usefulness. So actually, what's the benefit that technology is going to offer to me and how useful is it going to be in my life? And then the second one is actually how easy is it to use? So how easy is it to access? Is it expensive? Like how accessible is it to me? So obviously with a microchip, there are a couple of varying factors because when you think of actually how useful it is to you, there is the potential there for it to be quite a useful device. But obviously when we think about the ease of use, there are a lot of barriers. So it's obviously quite invasive in comparison to a lot of other tech solutions that are out there. So like you said, you've got your Apple Pay on your phone or through your smartwatch, which essentially does the same thing. So I think essentially we need to think about, where are the areas where it's going to add the most value to our lives, and actually that's going to affect our adoption of that kind of technology, because at the moment there are still, some big barriers. And also it brings up a couple of other questions as well. So, using your phone to pay for your groceries is all well and good, but actually when you're thinking about an implant, people have big questions around privacy, around health, like how it's going to affect your health, because at the moment it is still so new that actually there haven't been enough people that have trialed the tech to understand really the implications. Interestingly enough, I was going to mention when we talked about Opal and Oyster, I don't know if you've seen in the news recently, but there was a biohacker called Meow Meow here in Australia, who recently got in a little bit of trouble. So he essentially
a biohacker.
Yes. So basically he looks at essentially, and he well, not your chip, but just generally looks at like different uses for technology. He actually chopped up his Opal card and he took the chip from his Opal card and put it in a plastic casing and actually inserted it under his skin, which is quite different to what these microchips are. But essentially he was asked to make a payment on the train, and when he wasn't able to show a valid Oyster card, he got pulled over, and actually he's been in the news a lot because he was taken to court by the local transport authority, because essentially he's defacing government property by damaging the Opal card. But there was news that came out just the other day that actually his court case has been overturned, so he has won the case, which might potentially affect the uses for microchips and how we can actually put that information on the chip moving forward.
Because there's been an explosion in nanotechnology as technology gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And, there's things where you can swallow things and people can use that in medical science. And it just seems that that we're just not keeping up with that in terms of the legislation.
Yeah, and I think it's quite hard for governments to keep up with that from a legislation standpoint, because this tech's evolving so quickly. And also people are finding new use cases and new kind of ways to use this tech on a daily basis, which makes it quite hard to actually understand, where do we draw that line? And I think that from a government perspective, the only way that they're going to actually be able to evolve and update the legislation is just on a case-by-case basis, as and when people find these new ways to use the tech. Because it's quite hard to predict actually how it's going to be used.
So from your personal perspective,
Mhm.
apart from the fact that you've probably had a bit of a laugh by just going up to a door and opening doors just by waving it, and how did you do that? I mean, have you actually got a benefit from it or a use case from it?
I think it depends. So in terms of the actual using it from an office perspective, I use it on a daily basis. So there is some utility value there, like how much someone would actually prioritize that. Obviously, it's quite a small benefit. I think it's quite interesting because there are other markets that are using it for that purpose. So there's a company in Sweden who are called Epicenter, and they've basically offered voluntary chipping to 150 employees. So that is one way of using it. I think at the moment, it's more a form of technology that has a lot of opportunity rather than like viable use cases right now. So obviously I haven't actually put my Opal card or my bank card on the chip yet, but when I do, I can see that there would be a real value to doing it. There are a couple of other ways that we've talked about how we would use the tech. So I think obviously you mentioned as well from a nanotech perspective, the medical benefits. So a couple of ways that we've discussed. So obviously the first one would be quite simple. So actually just storing and housing your medical data. So like, for example, if you were in an accident and you were unable to communicate, if you were allergic to something or, if you'd had a pre-existing condition, that's quite an easy way of someone being able to quite quickly identify that, which could have a really huge effect on the treatment that you receive as a result. And obviously there are certain ways at the moment that you can identify that. So, the bracelets that people wear, etc. But this is a way that just kind of ensures that you will definitely have that information on you in the case of an accident. So I think that's a really interesting way. And I think that actually when we think about it for medical purposes, that's probably where we see the least, I guess, less of a barrier, just because we can see more of a benefit. So you think about like the things that we already put in our body. So the fact that people have pacemakers or cochlear implants. If you could, for example, have one of these microchips and you're a diabetic and actually it's able to monitor your blood sugar levels in real time and feed that information to you, then you could know how to respond immediately, which is a really clear value and utility to someone. So I think that there are ways that actually, from a health perspective, it could have a big impact. The other use cases at the moment, I think, probably still feel a little bit novel just because we have the opportunity to use our phones or our smartwatches or other wearable devices. And I do think that there is probably a wave of devices that are going to come before wearables, before implants. So the fact that like smart rings are probably the next step.
Hearables and glasses.
Yeah, and I think that there are a couple of different ways depending on how we're going to use the tech, right? So, for example, a smart ring, being able to wear the ring and make the payments, but still having that option to remove that technology and take it off when you choose to, is probably the first step towards seeing what the benefit could be. But yeah, I think it's definitely going to be something that we're thinking about from a much longer term perspective, and the adoption of kind of implant technology is going to be quite slow. But I think the more and more as we see the benefits and the ways that it can actually impact our lives, then the more likely we're going to be to start to adopt it.
So what about things like bionic arms and using implants like for eyes or things like that, where where we can actually get either as good as human products or better than?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, actually. So I was watching, there's a series on Netflix called The Dark Net.
Yes.
I don't know if you've seen it, but there's essentially one of the episodes is actually about a man who lost one of his eyes, and he actually creates a replica of a human eye, but it's a camera. And he's a filmmaker, and then he produces film footage using the camera, which is really interesting. So when we were doing the Technology Expo, we looked at several different types of technology. So we had kind of your Microsoft HoloLens headsets, we had different biometric devices, and we had smart clothing. And one of the things that we did talk about is actually, like you mentioned, like bionic arms and technology that's actually limb replacement. And it's quite an interesting topic, because when I was talking to Shanti, who works at Future Sumo, we were talking about the fact that there potentially is going to be a day when actually that technology is more desirable than having human limbs, because
Yes.
there'll be so much of a benefit to doing it. Like there'll be certain jobs that we'll be able to adopt. There'll be certain things that we'll be able to do that we weren't able to do before, which is quite a scary reality when you think about it. But like the very idea of humanity and technology completely and utterly fusing together, I think is something that could genuinely, it could become like this tipping point where we actually, it's not seen as being detrimental to have to lose a limb, because actually the benefit of having a bionic arm or whatever it is actually, you know, desired by people.
Yeah, I mean, you can already run faster with a set of blades than you can with a pair of legs. So if your measurement is about running fast, then it's better to have the blades. At the moment, I think what we tend to see is the bionic arms. It's more about robotics, and I think that's kind of the mechanics. And I think there's kind of this merger of the robotics, I'll use artificial intelligence as a sort of an umbrella term, which is meaning that there's going to be some sort of thought process within that. But yeah, I mean, why? I mean, you know, the bionic man is a reality, I think.
Yeah, and I think that that's definitely the way that technology could go, and potentially, and probably will go. But at what point will that tipping point kind of occur? To be honest, I have no idea.
And I think you're right in the fact that people are probably more inclined to, you know, have a, you know, hearables or a pair of glasses. I know that people joked about the Snapchat glasses, but you know, in effect, it was a step on an evolution. I watched the film Oceans. Is it Ocean's 8 or Ocean's 9? 8. Yeah, where basically they had a pair of glasses to scan. I don't want to spoil it for anybody. Where they used it to scan something, and that's all possible. Whether actually people are going to start doing it with their eyes, which is a little bit more Deadpool 2, if rather than Ocean's 8. So, but yeah, I can see people that people are more used to using the watches but you know, at some point, there's going to be a jump, isn't it? If we think about, you know, I grew up with Nokia phones. I thought they were fantastic. And then the iPhone came out, and there was that jump in technology. And then there was an acceptance that's actually the way the technology is. And then we've had all kinds of apps like Shazam and Snapchat and things, which would never have been designed in the Nokia days. So I guess, you know, we're waiting for the bright young things to come up with the ideas to present for the future.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, and that's kind of what we cover from a Merge perspective, is actually looking at what are those stages that are going to get us there, because it is going to be kind of a long process in terms of getting to that point. So when we think about like you said, the tech that's more easily accessible, so, you know, wearing a smart ring, wearing augmented reality glasses. And I think that actually one area that I'm also really interested in is augmented reality. And I just think that, you know, previously when Google released Google Glass, people actually thought that kind of technology had potentially been a bit of a failure because it disappeared. But actually what had happened is that Google had actually thought about, you know, where they could see the most benefit, and they started going into manufacturing. So actually in a lot of kind of factories, workers wear Google glasses because actually it can feed them information around the products. Or, you know, when you're building a car, actually which bolt do I need to replace a certain part is quite an easy way to see how it would add value. Whereas I don't think at the moment there's necessarily an option out there which is as seamless as what we see in Ocean's 8. Or I actually think of, I don't know if you saw the latest Kingsman movie.
I haven't, no.
He had similar thing with the glasses, but he was talking to someone in another room through the glasses, and he was feeding him information. So I think that definitely it's going to become really interesting. But at the moment, all of the kind of headsets and the options are still quite clunky and quite.
Yeah, I think from a headset perspective, people aren't going to wear headsets. I mean, I actually got Google Cardboard. And played with that for about 30 minutes and then realized it made me feel car sick. And I think that the big headsets are really just a step in terms of the evolution. And I think that it was probably quite a surprise for Google when they produced the Google Glass. I went to the London launch of Google Glass and I thought they were rubbish. I mean, it was like having, it was about as powerful as a ZX80 on your head, which was like in today's is just like, and I think that everyone thought that Google Glass was a business to consumer opportunity.
Yeah.
But actually it's a business to business opportunity. And the problem with business to business is we're very conservative and we don't like trying things new. So you have to go through a very difficult process in terms of use case. And that's very difficult for the startup market when you don't have a lot of money or a lot of resources. But absolutely, I think, using augmented reality in business to business, fixing airplanes, airplane maintenance, absolutely. If it's not being used already, I'm sure it is, then it will be used in the future.
And I think that's the thing. And I think one thing that you mentioned is, the quality of the experience at the moment. And with augmented reality glasses, it's just not there. Like you look at any of the adverts for Microsoft HoloLens or for Google Glass, and actually what you see in the advert from a display perspective doesn't marry up to the actual experience of using it. So it's quite a limited field. Like it's not particularly clear. So I think that there's a lot of advancements that need to be made, firstly from a quality perspective, but secondly from a design perspective. When you've got a Google Glass teaming up with a Ray-Bans or a desirable model of glass, then actually you'll start to see people kind of thinking, oh, actually this technology is quite cool, those glasses look quite cool, like maybe I'll give it a go.
There was an article that came out yesterday about PayPal that had got some augmented reality glasses. And it's great. I enjoy the articles from a debate perspective, but walking around the supermarket with like a big, it's a bit like meow, meow, you'll be arrested.
Yeah.
If you're walking around with those things, the police would be called. I mean, that's a fact.
Yeah.
Because people wouldn't understand it. It's not a good look now. Remi, it's been fascinating. Thank you so much for your time. It's taken us about 9 months, I think, to get to this point, but I really appreciate you spending the time and having the conversation with me today.
Broken foot.
Yeah, your broken foot, and all kinds of things. But it's been great to talk to you. Yeah. It's a fantastic journey, and I think there's an awful lot for us to learn and think about from this. I really appreciate your time today.
Perfect, no problem.
So remind people where they can get hold of you again.
So you can check me out on LinkedIn, so Remi Baker at PhD Sydney, or through my Twitter account, which is at Remi_Baker. Or
on your left hand, which has got your NFC chip in, which has got your LinkedIn profile.
Yeah.
Okay. Cheers, Remi. Thanks very much for today. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.